Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's wonderful to see you all today. It's an honor to be here. And I just want to echo Monty in saying how valuable the APS collections are to people who are interested in Indigenous history, and also, in my case, early American history. In 1520, a native teenager was abducted from a coastal region called Chicora of what is now South Carolina. The teen, later baptized as Francisco de Chicora, had been lured or forced onto a Spanish galleon alongside 140 other native people. The ship's captain, an experienced slave raider, had already abducted at least 900 indigenous people from the nearby Bahamas. In fact, slavers had so devastated the native population of the Bahamas that they ventured farther north to the North American mainland. And this is basically the area I'm going to be talking about today, from St. Augustine all the way up to Charleston, South Carolina. When the Spanish slave ship landed in Winyah Bay in South Carolina, the native people of the region initially fled, but the invaders feigned peace and offered them gifts, luring Francisco and dozens of others on board. The first well-documented slaving expedition in what's now the United States, Gordillo's voyage marks a key moment in the history of indigenous enslavement, which ultimately ensnared 3 to 5 million native people of the Americas. After a voyage down the Atlantic coast and into the Caribbean, Francisco de Chicora departed in Hispaniola, where he was enslaved by Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón. A judge and member of the Royal Council of Hispaniola, Ayllón owned plantations and mines where he forced hundreds of indigenous slaves to toil. But he wanted more. In 1526, Ayllón sailed to South Carolina, determined to start the first colony on the North American mainland. The vessels carried 600 people, including Spanish colonists, missionaries, and enslaved people from Africa and the Americas. Among the passengers was Francisco de Chicora, who had become Ayllón's most trusted translator. Francisco had worked hard to earn his master's esteem, telling Ayllón exactly what he wanted to hear, that his homeland was rich and that he, Francisco, would help him take it. Ayllón, like many enslavers, believed that his captives loved him, and he trusted Francisco. But instead of participating in Ayllón's conquest, Francisco and the other enslaved Native Americans ran away. Manipulating Ayllón, Francisco had emancipated himself and returned. Still, Ayllón persisted, leaning on enslaved Africans to build the new colony after the native people fled. But unable to navigate inland without indigenous slaves and discouraged by the sandy soil, Ayllón sailed south and founded the colony of San Miguel de Guadalupe, probably in Georgia's Sapelo Sound. Shortly thereafter, they ran out of food and disease broke out. Many colonists, including Ayllón, died. A mutiny ensued. After seizing power, the new commanding officer demanded food from local Wali Indians. The Walis, who had heretofore tolerated the newcomers, attacked the Spanish colony. Enslaved Africans also rebelled, setting fire to the Spaniards' houses. Defeated, the 150 Spanish survivors sailed back to Hispaniola. The first European colony in what's now the U.S. failed, toppled by indigenous and African resistance. So part of what I argue here today is that the site of mainland North America's first colonies, the South was also where the anti-slavery struggle was born. This story is part of my current book project, which I'm calling American Abolitions, the slow death and many afterlives of slavery. It examines efforts to abolish or prohibit slavery in North America from the 1500s to the 1800s. The story of American slavery was once safely quarantined in the antebellum South, where it did not threaten a cherished national narrative focused on freedom. But mounting evidence demonstrates that American bondage had a much longer scale and broader scope. My first book joined a wave of scholarship that uncovered slavery in surprising places. Colonial Santa Fe, Ivy League campuses, St. Louis trading houses, Montreal kitchens, and California mines. Despite the new wealth of scholarship, we don't yet have a synthetic work that revisits fundamental questions about American slavery and American freedom. And so I intend this book as a step in that direction. American Abolitions demonstrates that colonialism over the course of centuries brought disparate, ever-changing practices of slavery into contact across the continent. Still, slavery was inherently unstable, in part because it was contested by enslaved people, dissenting voices from within slaving societies, or rival powers, including native nations. The early portion of the book focuses on attempts to abolish or prohibit slavery in the colonial South, and that's the focus of my talk today. The book is comparative, so what I'd like to do for the rest of my time today is to talk about 3 important attempts to abolish or prohibit slavery in the colonial South, and then draw some conclusions. So one of the points that I make in the book is that from the earliest days of colonization, critics targeted slavery. Responding to religious and humanitarian concerns, Spain banned the enslavement of indigenous Americans in 1542. This followed years of debate and pressure from figures like Bartolomé de las Casas and Pope Paul III. King Charles I forbade enslaving indigenous people or forcibly removing them from their homelands. This measure was fairly effective at ending slavery for 2,500 American Indian slaves held in the Iberian Peninsula, but it was less effective in the rest of the empire. There are many reasons for this, but the most relevant to this project in particular is that the edict was impossible to enforce in areas of weak imperial control, like the northern part of the Spanish Empire, meaning the southeast and the southwest of what's today the United States. And even in areas of strong imperial control, the Spanish monarchs sought to placate colonists and maintain revenues, so they created new forms of unfree labor. These legal unfree labor forms persisted in practices like debt bondage, encomiendas, repartimientos, and the mining labor draft, or mita. Influenced by Spain's anti-slavery measures, the Lords Proprietors who ruled early Carolina banned indigenous enslavement there. Chartered in 1663, Carolina was a proprietary colony. The Lords Proprietors were 8 Englishmen to whom Charles II granted the joint ownership of the land. Although the king retained full sovereignty over Carolina, he granted the Lords Proprietors extensive powers to establish civil structures, to collect taxes and duties, and to maintain order, as well as to have certain game and mineral ownership. The Fundamental Constitutions, Carolina's first governing document, was the work of Lord Ashley and his secretary, John Locke, and it had much to say about relations with Native Americans. The Fundamental Constitutions gave the Lords Proprietors the exclusive right to negotiate with Native nations for land and a monopoly on trade with Native people. The document also extended religious freedom to settlers and Native people alike and bound the colony to prosecute crimes by whites against American Indians. On the topic of slavery, the Constitution declared that, quote, no Indian upon any occasion or pretense whatsoever is to be made a slave, or without his own consent be carried out of Carolina. Those same freedoms did not extend to Black enslaved people. So the fundamental constitutions, for example, made it clear that conversion would not free a Black enslaved person. So why did the Lords Proprietors single out Native Americans? There were several reasons for this. First, it was expensive to send English soldiers to fight in wars, so they counted on Native military allies to protect the colonies. Also, making enemies of indigenous nations through slavery would disrupt trade, minimizing returns on the trade monopoly held by the Lords Proprietors. And the fur trade in this era is big business, so economically it's really important to survival of the colony. And finally, the proprietors feared that enslaving Native individuals would lead Native nations to ally with the Spanish, who then controlled Florida. Well, it's one thing to write a lofty constitution and another thing to actually enforce it. From the beginning, colonists ignored the ban on Native enslavement. That disobedience included those at the highest rank, the colony's governors and council members. Colonists sought enslaved people as laborers and as saleable commodities. Most of the early colonists from Carolina came from Barbados, where American Indians and Africans alike were enslaved. Decades earlier, in the 1630s, the Barbadian governor had declared that all Africans and Native Americans brought to the island were to be considered enslaved unless they had a contract that said otherwise. Colonists, including the colony's leaders, came to Carolina to make money, and they expected to command enslaved labor to do so. Also, because Carolina was a proprietary colony and not a royal colony, there was no great benefit to being a good servant to the empire. So Carolina's leaders could not hope to rise in administrative ranks to gain more favorable positions elsewhere in the empire. And finally, there are few consequences for enslaving Native Americans illegally. The worst consequence that you can find in the records is being removed from one's position in governance. And because support for Indigenous enslavement was nearly universal in Carolina, the Lords Proprietors had difficulty in finding administrators who would actually enforce their laws. Insofar as colonists felt they needed to justify Indigenous enslavement, they leaned on the theory of just war. That is, captives taken in a just war could be offered enslavement as an alternative to death. They extended this argument to include buying captives taken by others in, quote, just wars. The Lords Proprietors issued repeated warnings about the danger of enslaving close neighbors, but ultimately found that they could not prohibit the enslavement of American Indians. So they tried to restrict their practice. First, they restricted the enslavement of Native people who live within 200 miles of the colony, later 400 miles. They also prohibited colonists from directly enslaving Native people. They outlawed the deportation of enslaved Native people from Carolina. And Carolina's governors had varying attitudes about these regulations, but colonists mostly ignored them. By 1707, the Lords Proprietors withdrew from colonial affairs, only participating to the extent that they appointed governors. However, Native nations devastated by the American Indian slave trade took action. There was a large uprising against Native enslavement in the Yamasee War of 1715 to 1717. The Yamasees used to reside within Carolina's mission within Florida's mission system, but they deserted and moved to South Carolina in the 1680s. Thereafter, they became allies of South Carolina. They traded in Indian slaves. But problems arose because of the trade. And what I'm showing you guys now is a journal of the Commons House of Assembly minutes, and these are almost all preserved at the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. And especially after the Lords Proprietors withdrew from colonial affairs, this is the most important governing body in colonial South Carolina. And this is a really biased document. I mean, most of the men who were involved in the assembly were in favor of Indigenous enslavement. But even within this very biased source, there's a lot of record of trader abuses. So it's still a useful source. So what are some of the issues that led up to the Yamasee War? By 1711, the Yamasees were 100,000 deerskins in debt to traders, which is twice South Carolina's annual export average. Traders had also committed a number of outrages, which are documented in these pages, including fraud and deception to drive up debt, and most gallingly to Native people, enslaving free people. There are lots of recorded examples in this source, and what you're seeing here is from 1706. These are charges against a trader named John Musgrove, and various people, including chiefs from some of these local villages, claimed that Musgrove had enslaved between 6 and 16 free Native people on the pretense that they had, quote, killed some of his cattle. South Carolina's Indian agent Thomas Nairn, who had been very much involved in slave raiding in the South, especially in Florida, he created this map based partially on his knowledge of the geography. He met with the Yamasee chiefs and other people who were disaffected with the trade on April 14th of 1715. And he probably went to bed that night thinking that he had mended relations with the Yamasees, but he awoke to a different reality. That morning, on Good Friday, Yamasees dragged Nairn to their central square, where they bound the trader to a post and executed him. Other nations dissatisfied with traders joined in. These included many of the most powerful nations in the South, the Muskogee Creeks, the Savannahs, and the Appalachians, killed nearly all of their traders. About 90 people were killed in the first week of the war. Then they moved in on Carolina. They burned dozens of plantations. They drove settlers into Charlestown and killed 400 colonists, which is about 7% of the white population of that colony. Fearing complete destruction of their colony, South Carolinians cobbled together an army drawn from their own militia, from enslaved African Americans, friendly Native nations, and volunteers from Virginia and North Carolina. This force pursued a brutal campaign against the war's instigators. They enslaved most of the Yamasee survivors, and those who escaped sought Spanish protection at St. Augustine. The war concluded in 1717 when South Carolina made peace with the remaining nations and gained an important ally in the Cherokees. So overall, in thinking about the Yamasee War, I frame it as an indigenous anti-slavery movement that effectively destroyed the southeastern trade in enslaved American Indians in the region that you see here, and reshaped other areas of colonial law and practice. One of the many consequences of the Yamasee War was the founding of Georgia. So by the end of the war, there are promotional tracts arguing for a colony south of Carolina as a kind of buffer colony. Two main reasons are given for this. One is that Georgia is supposed to, quote, possess fertile land sufficient to subsist all the useless poor in England and distressed Protestants in Europe. The founder and leader of the colony, James Edward Oglethorpe, was famous for conducting a parliamentary investigation into the condition of London's prisons, and he exercised a leading role in the movement to found the new colony. So at the time, it was thought that criminal behavior like begging, cheating, or robbing were caused by idleness and necessity. And so this was intended as a kind of haven of free white labor. And from the beginning, there's an anti-slavery imperative, although it really emphasizes benefits for white society. Part of the idea of colonial Georgia was that it would produce profitable commodities that did not require enslaved labor. So as part of these promotional tracts, they claimed Georgia being, quote, about the same latitude with part of China, Persia, Palestine, and the Madeiras, should be able to make raw silk, wine, oil, drugs, dyes, and many other commercial manufactures. So the first impetus in Georgia is this idea of a white debtors colony. The second is a kind of military imperative. So in part in response to the Yamasee War, there's an idea to build a series of fortifications between colonial South Carolina and Spanish Florida to protect the southern end of Britain's mainland colonies with Native people as allies in this process. And part of the reason why there was such anxiety about Florida was that it had become a haven for free people of African descent. There was a black militia there as early as 1683, and enslaved people in the Carolinas knew about this. They knew about Florida's kind of politics of freedom and the ways in which people of African descent could gain access to greater freedom. So in 1687, that's the first year that we see documented runaway enslaved people from South Carolina showing up in St. Augustine. And following several other instances of this, in November of 1693, Charles II gives this edict granting freedom to self-emancipating people from British colonies. So I'm showing part of this edict here, and what's really interesting about this is that it shows which way the agency is flowing in this situation. So it's actually 10 enslaved people who had escaped from the city of Charleston, arrived to South Carolina asking for conversion and to be adopted into the Catholic faith. And they're the ones who are moving imperial policy. It's not the other way around. And so for the next 100 years, roughly, this policy of acknowledging the freedom of self-emancipating people from the Carolinas endures. So there are so many people who emancipate themselves by claiming sanctuary in Spanish Florida, but that by 1738 there is a garrison of free black soldiers at Fort Mose, which is just outside of St. Augustine. And part of what is driving the establishment of Georgia is a fear of black and indigenous neighbors, and especially the question of slavery. So this is all coming to the fore when Georgia is founded. The ban on black slavery was not explicit in Georgia's original founding documents, but within 2 years, the trustees who control early Georgia do explicitly outlaw the enslavement of African-descended people. And I should stress here that this is not about universalist humanitarian concerns. There's really concern for African or African-descended people themselves, and there's no ambition to abolish or prohibit slavery outside of the Georgia colony. But still, many colonists protest the ban. The first complaint was from a South Carolina lumber merchant named Samuel Evely, who claimed that Georgians would never make money without slavery. By 1735, the same year that the official ban was introduced, there was a more organized pro-slavery faction led by wealthy men who had paid their own way to Georgia. On the other side were Oglethorpe and two important settler groups, the Salzburgers, who were Protestants who had been expelled from Salzburg and what's now Austria, and the Highland Scots at Darien, who were the colony's main white military force. One thing that's interesting about this pro-slavery group is that it's really the first time that colonists in the British Empire have been called upon to defend slavery. You know, it was legal in all other spaces of the Americas. And so the arguments that the pro-slavery group developed are really historically important. They gained the most traction from an argument that blended biological and environmental racism. They argued that due to Georgia's hot and humid climate, quote, the impossibility of white men being able to work and live there. And even at the time, some white Georgia settlers, including the Salzburgers, critiqued this argument. The Salzburgers pointed out, for example, that they could produce much more rice than they could consume. They called the pro-slavery party idle, delicate, and unreasonable. The Darien Scots, among many other British colonists and officials, also worried about the security of the southern border. And this only seemed to be confirmed by the Stono Revolt, which I can talk about in more detail in the Q&A if you guys want to hear about it. But eventually, Georgia does, of course, reverse the ban. And this has to do with the end of the War of Jenkins' Ear, which is the best named of all of the colonial wars. In the aftermath of peace with Spain in 1748, the military rationale for slavery's prohibition declined. And Oglethorpe himself left the colony's support in Parliament weakened. The rallying cry for the pro-slavery party became, quote, liberty and property without restrictions. In May of 1749, the trustees caved to Georgia's pro-slavery faction, and 2 years later, slavery became legal in Georgia in 1751. So as I conclude here, I want to talk about some key takeaways from thinking about these comparative examples. Perhaps most obviously, these movements are related. Empires sought to secure what historian Christopher Brown calls moral capital by placing themselves at the vanguard of humanitarian movements. In doing so, they justified their dominion in colonial expansion. In the colonial South, Britain, Spain, and France jockeyed for power. And the cases I've explored today, the Lords Proprietors were influenced by earlier Spanish prohibitions. Later, the southern colonies in Spanish Florida sought to weaken one another, in part through policies of slavery and anti-slavery. But those same policies were influenced by people on the ground, including people victimized by slavery. So these groups included Francisco de Chicora and his fellow slaves in the Ione colony, Native nations during the Yamasee War, and self-emancipated Black Carolinians who fled to Florida to shape the Spanish Empire's sanctuary policy. The second point I'll make is that there's a persistence of localism in this story. There's a rejection of imperial rule, whether it's via proprietors, trustees, or the crown. And because of this localism, colonies sought to distinguish different forms of unfreedom in law and practice, suited to different conditions. They also sought to distinguish between Black and Indigenous slavery, and between slavery and other forms of bondage, like debt peonage, convict labor, and revivals of serfdom, like the encomienda. Georgia also shows us that this is not a straightforward story of progress. It demonstrates the precarity and mutability of anti-slavery measures. The scholarship on this topic of anti-slavery typically traces abolition from the Revolutionary era, seeing these earlier movements as disconnected. But I'd argue that these anti-slavery movements in the early modern period were widespread, though not unified, and they still shaped what came later. So in just one example of this, in 1775, the descendants of the same Darien Scots who had stood with Oglethorpe against slavery petitioned the leaders of the Continental Congress to abolish slavery because it was, quote, an unnatural practice founded in injustice and cruelty. Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. I think we have just a few minutes for questions. There are, yes, here. Wait. The microphone. And please say your name and where you're from before you ask your question. Thanks.
Richard Kagan from Philadelphia. Thank you for that overview. I have one question about indigenous slavery among Choctaws and various other groups before the Spaniards and before the Americans. There is a tradition there, and how does if you were a slave in indigenous groups, is it in perpetuity, or is it more like the Spanish say, basically it's one generation at a time? That's my first question. The second one, given the presence of African slaves on the South Carolina coast in the 1520s, why does the New York Times persist with its so-called 1619 project? Seems to be off by a little more than a century.
Thank you for your questions. Great questions. So, I talked a little bit about this indigenous slave trade, and the way that I would describe it is that when colonists come, they heighten and exacerbate these pre-existing tensions between Native nations. And so there have been traditions of taking war captives in Native nations. And in my first book, I talked about basically how Europeans tap into this. And a similar thing actually happened in Africa, where it becomes commercialized and part of this global trade. So there are new imperatives, new pressures. And what I would say is that, what Europeans are tapping into is these war captives, right? The idea of trading war captives for these new commodities like firearms, which many Native nations come to see as essential in this era of an arms race and, protection from colonial empires. So it does exist, but there's very different practice within indigenous communities versus what happens with European empires. So within Native communities, many different things happen. A prisoner of war could be executed. They could also be adopted into a family to replace a deceased family member. They could be traded to allies as a kind of sign of goodwill. But in European empire, and I should say that condition did not pass on to children. So it's not a heritable condition that becomes defined in a racial or ethnic way. It's just the condition of one individual, at max over the course of a lifetime. And those conditions become completely dissociated once Europeans get into the picture within a European context. And then your second question about 1619 Project, I guess I would say that, I think the overall impetus of the project is correct in the sense that, colonialism is deeply implicated with slavery and has to do with the country's origins and is around from the very earliest days of quote-unquote exploration. And I would just say that part of the issue is that there's a real focus on the English colonies. And that focus has always been around in early American history. And part of what I'm bringing to this discussion is, earlier forms of slavery that existed within the Spanish Empire, for example, and even the enslavement of native peoples at Jamestown, for example, actually began some years before 1619 with victims of the First Anglo-Powhatan War. So there were native people taken as prisoners in that war and made slaves in Jamestown. So I would just say yes, and also it's even older than we might appreciate. Thank you.
Questions in the balcony? Question down here, yes.
Thank you for that fabulous talk, Anita Allen from Haverford, Pennsylvania. All of my third great-grandparents were enslaved in Georgia. And I'm wondering, given the very fascinating story you told us about how slavery came to be permitted in the Georgia colony, what sense do we make of this pervasive idea heard not only in popular culture, but also in the halls of elite universities, that somehow African Americans were better off for having had their ancestors be enslaved? I just wondered how to think about that claim in light of what you have now uncovered about the history of slavery in the United States.
Thank you so much for that question. I think that even though the stories that I'm telling today are hundreds of years old, they are still so ever present in our modern discourse and in the way that these events are misremembered and misrepresented in popular culture. And so I would say that, this idea that slavery was everywhere, that it was natural, that no one contested it is just a lie. So one of the things that I would point out is, like, from the earliest days of slavery, there are critics of slavery from within settler societies, from other polities, from native nations. So that criticism is always there, and people recognizing the inhumanity of the practice. The case of Georgia in particular, there's a new biography of Oglethorpe by Michael Thurman, and part of what he argues is that we need to really rethink the origins of the Georgia colony, and it's kind of, at the time, radical utopian ideas that rejected slavery as being the basis of the colony. I think a lot of times we can think of history as being linear, that, it's getting better somehow, or that there's a kind of singular trajectory. And I think what this story shows us is that Georgia began in a certain way and then took this radically different course. But just to go to your point, that there have always been these critics, and even within white Georgians, this kind of anti-slavery vocalization that persisted for decades.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.